All right, folks, we're going to give this a shot again. I think we just got kicked off of YouTube, so hopefully this doesn't kick us off at another time. I'm going to do my little intro again. And basically today we're interviewing a really special author who specializes in a type of natural building that I've been interested in a long time that a lot of people have never heard of. And so if you're interested in natural buildings that don't have red list chemicals, which are basically the cancerous chemicals that most of our modern building materials have in them, that actually not just cancer causing, they cause all sorts of disease. Natural building is a methodology that allows us to build and meet a lot of our comfort expectations while leveraging properties and materials on bioregionally accessible, hopefully even on our site, in a way that is beneficial to us, but also to the ecosystems around us. And so natural building kind of gets relegated to kind of hippie stuff, but it's really gaining a lot of traction. And I think that it absolutely has a really important role to play in the construction of healthy buildings into the future. So before I introduce Lydia, I just wanted to tell you guys a little bit about ideas on the Verge. And so today we're going to be doing an interview like we have been for several weeks in the past now. And at the end of this interview, we're going to be giving a coupon code for this particular book, which is Light Clay Straw, right before we go to questions. And we're also going to be giving a book away in today's session as well. And so back when Michelle and I were writing our rainwater harvesting book, we loved working with New Society so much that we kind of came up with this idea to start interviewing some of these incredible thought leaders that they have within their wheelhouse, these people that are sharing all of their incredible knowledge with the world by writing these books and helping to get their message out to our community who's interested in sustainability and permaculture and regenerative farming. And so twice a month, we get these incredible opportunities to speak to these thought leaders and ask them hard questions and understand their story and how they got to where they are. It's been really insightful for me. I've learned a ton from all of these incredible authors, and I know that you guys have as well. And so feel free to let us know where you're calling in from and one thing you want to get out of today's session. So if you don't know about light clay straw, it might just be, I want to learn about light clay straw. If you've got questions about light clay straw like I do, because I've been studying it for a little while and thinking about how different applications that it can have within buildings, you might have more advanced questions. And so you can start posting those up in the chat window, and I'll go back at the end of the session and collect those questions. We just love to see this community interacting with each other, because it's great that there are so many like minds that come to these videos and have these conversations. So make sure you're getting up into the chat there. And if you find this conversation interesting, you can hit the share button, share it on your social media channel. It always helps the video to track. And remember that this video will be live on the YouTube channel, on the Verge YouTube channel afterwards. So if you want to watch it again, make sure you come back and have a watch. So Sarah, do you want to give us a little bit of information on New Society Publishers and kind of how you guys fit into all of this?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rob. I'm excited to be here again. I'm really enjoying getting to be a part of these conversations and learning more than I thought I would about sustainable buildings. So that's really exciting. For those of you who don't know, New Society is an activist solutions-oriented publisher. We pride ourselves on walking our talk and having the highest environmental and social standards of any publisher in North America. This includes stuff like we print all of our books on 100% post-consumer recycled paper. We print only in North America, never overseas. We've been a carbon neutral company since 2006. Our employees are shareholders in the company, and we're also a certified B Corporation. So we like to say our books are so green you could eat them, but you probably shouldn't. If you want to find more out about us, you can check out our website or any of our other social sites. I'd just like to quickly add that a lot of our spring books are starting to come off press. And if you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, you can enter to win the books that are coming off press every other Thursday by posting questions for the authors. We're thrilled to be able to collaborate with Verge Permaculture on this project. We really think that the sharing of ideas and information on as many platforms as possible is key to creating community and real change in the world. And I really want to give a shout out to all of our authors for their willingness to share their often hard-won knowledge and expertise with readers. It can be really comforting when you're embarking on a new project or contemplating new and challenging ideas to know that someone else has been through it before you and can walk you through it and help you miss those potholes that might reveal themselves along the way. So thanks very much, Lydia, for joining us. And it's really nice to get to meet you in a virtual way. And I'm really looking forward to today's interview.
So before I bring Lydia on, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about her. This is right off the bio, off the back of her book, and I had a great conversation with her yesterday. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting interview today. But Lydia Dolman wrote a book about light clay construction, which is what we're talking about today. And she's a licensed contractor, taught carpentry and natural building at the Solar Energy International in Colorado, and was lead ecological builder for Portland's city repair project, which is super interesting because I love city repair. So we might even talk a little bit about city repair today. She's created beautiful, high-performance, low-impact buildings across the Northeast, from Portland's first permitted straw bale home and the Rebuilding Center's Cobb entryway to a 3,300 square foot light straw clay brewery. That sounds like a delicious conversation as well. She's written from the Last Straw Journal and permaculture activist, and appeared in both the NBC News and HGTV's Offbeat America. So Lydia lives in Southern Oregon. So welcome to the show, Lydia.
Thanks for having me, Rob. Thanks for the great intro and good work, Sarah. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So tell us how you got into natural building. Like, what was your path into this space? What were you doing before you were building straw houses?
Well, the short version of a long story is that I've always loved building, but I think maybe a little bit due to my gender, it wasn't really encouraged as a career path. And I was trying to figure out a way to combine studying art and ecology and social justice. And I went and visited a straw bale work site where there were a lot of women in Montana, and basically the clouds parted and I saw the light, and I've been doing that for about the last 20 years.
Awesome. And so how does the city repair project fit into all of that?
Another good question. In the, early 2000s, I was trying to decide where I wanted to move next, because I'd been working rurally in Colorado, and I felt like working rurally was having an impact, but not as much of an impact as working in an urban area. And I heard about the city repair project and that they had building convergence in the city. And I just felt like if I wanted to see natural building grow, and to be in me moving to Portland and also putting natural building essentially on the map and as a part of people's daily vocabulary in an urban area.
Right. So you must have been working with Mark Lakeman then.
I was.
Cool. I bet you that was a complete riot.
Yes.
Awesome. So, I mean, you've written a book about light clay straw, but I suspect that you've touched all aspects of natural building. What other types of natural building have you been involved in?
Well, primarily my focus has been straw bale. I do consider wood a natural building material, but straw bale, because it's legally recognized with code, most people have access. Really my introduction, because it represented using an agricultural waste product and being able to build buildings that were essentially artistic and sculptural. Right.
Interesting. And so if I understand your bio correctly, you built the light clay straw entrance. Is that building in Portland the one that where they kind of repurpose all the building materials?
Right, and that one, so there's basically three major types of wall systems, and straw bale is one of them, where it's basically stacking big fuzzy bricks, and then cob is another one where it's monolithic adobe, essentially. It's less straw and more clay, and that's what the entry to the rebuilding center is. And then light straw clay is sort of a
So Lydia, the sound is really choppy on our end, and so I'm wondering if we need to find another time to have this interview. It's kind of strange, but just because the sound is really cutting out on our end here.
I could do in 2 minutes, go to another building, and if we have a connection there, if you're open to a 2-minute pause.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. If you want to try and reconnect, I'll keep folks entertained on this end. I'll do some circus tricks, and we can try when you get a little bit closer to the router. Okay, so if you need to, just sign back in again, and but try and stay signed in if you can.
Okay.
So I'm curious, for the folks that are watching right now, how many people have explored natural building? And if you have, what kind of natural building have you taken a look at? Specifically, what, and actually, if you have looked at natural building, or maybe you've even built a natural building. So I'd like to know where you guys are at with regards to the your knowledge base with regards to natural building. So if you can put that up into the chat window, that'd be great. We're just going to be waiting a few minutes while Lydia changes position to try and get a better location for bandwidth. And so we can use this time right now. You can ask any questions you want of me, anything to do with permaculture, natural building, renewable energy. It's really interesting right now. I'm working on 2 super interesting projects in my work. I'm working on the 3rd living building challenge in the world. And so that's going to be going into Alberta. And so if you've never heard of the Living Building Challenge, it leverages a lot of natural building techniques. It can do, it doesn't have to. One of the guys that we interviewed on this show, actually, who wrote the composting toilet book, Gord Baird, actually lives in one of the first certified pedal project Living Building Challenge. So he didn't get quite the whole certification, but he was able to get quite far in that certification. I think he missed the materials pedal or something. But what's really cool about natural building and the Living Building Challenge is, and how those two potentially tie together is the Living Building Challenge, if you're going to meet certification requirements, requires you to meet 105% of all your energy locally. It requires you to have no red list chemicals in your building. It requires you to be net neutral in water, which is super interesting. It requires you to have cultural components. You actually have to have a building that interfaces with the local biome. And there's a few other components there that I'm missing. I don't have them all quite memorized. There's transport components, there's urban agriculture components. And so they're really, if you had to define the Living Building Challenge, it really is kind of be the closest thing to a permaculture building standard, which is kind of cool. And so one of the reasons I'm interested in talking to folks like Lydia is because these techniques like light clay straw, well, it's a tough sentence to say, can play a really important role when we're talking about different wall assemblies that leverage all of these different types of components. So I just saw that Lydia just showed back up again. Why don't we do a sound check really quickly here, Lydia, and see how the bandwidth is coming through.
Okay, I already, your sound is coming through better. And yes, light straw clay or light clay straw, it's a mouthful.
Totally. Are you in a light clay straw building right now?
I was earlier, which I suspect might have been a little bit of the problem because it does, the density of the wall tends to block wireless.
So this is one of those examples of the problem being the solution. I have a friend, he specializes in EMF assessments. And so he's done a full EMF assessment of our house. And it's crazy. I mean, we could have a whole show talking just about that. But one of the things I have heard about is that natural building clay in the walls can actually help to kind of absorb some of that EMF. So that's interesting. We got a real example of that live on YouTube.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so we were talking about the building that you did that light clay straw entrance to, and so that's one of the coolest projects I've ever heard about. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what that building does and why it was important that light clay straw was used at the entrance of that building.
Okay, well, just a quick little correction, and this might have gotten lost in the audio, is that actually the entrance to that building is made of cob.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah, so it's very similar. It's basically a natural material, whereas light straw clay even though it doesn't really make sense when you think about it, when you say light straw, it's actually heavy straw, light clay, and cob is we call it earth and masonry because basically it's like a microscopic brick wall, but the bricks are just little rocks held together by clay. And then there's a little bit of straw interspersed in that. And so that's what the entrance of the Rebuilding Center is. And the Rebuilding Center is run by a nonprofit, and they wanted their entryway to reflect inclusivity. And they wanted everybody possible to be able to participate in the construction of this. And so all natural building materials are really inclusive building materials because they're non-toxic, they're minimally processed, they're easy to use, wide variety of age ranges, they're low tech. So lots of people can participate in the building process. So we had hundreds of people work together to sculpt the entryway to that building.
Awesome. So for folks that have never heard of, and I think I keep pronouncing it backwards, light straw clay. I think I keep saying light clay straw, but light straw clay. Can you tell me the difference, or tell our audience the difference between a straw bale wall and a light straw clay wall?
Great question. Yeah, this is where I want to create some kind of flow chart, just because there's a lot of crossover. So straw bale is basically, if you're out in the country and you see bricks of straw or hay out in the field, it is baled straw. And you're generally, for the most part, building with straw, which is not hay, very different. Hay is a food source, straw is a waste product after the grain has been harvested. And so those are basically just big, fuzzy, well-insulated bricks that are a waste product to the way agriculture is practiced right now, that can be used. And they're very compatible with the way we build buildings because they're rectangular in a sense, and they're stackable and they're modular. Light straw clay essentially evolved, this is a long story, but evolved out of building techniques in Europe a couple centuries ago, where with timber framed buildings, where it's the heavy timber, where it's these big timber frames with nothing in between. And they have evolved from using something that had more of a cob-like consistency, where it was more clay and sand based, to something that had more straw fiber in it. And they realized they were getting much better insulation and it weighed less, so they were able to build up more. So light straw clay is essentially a loosened straw bale mixed with a clay slip like a binder and then packed into a form. And the big distinction between light straw clay and straw bale is that straw bale can be load bearing, whereas light straw clay cannot. And just since I'm saying light straw clay 5 million times, and I probably will for the rest of our conversation, is that it goes by a lot of names. And one is light straw clay, one is light clay straw, slip straw. The German word is, oh my gosh, I'm totally drawing up. And I want to say pajareke, which is Spanish, Leischlembau. So there's a lot of different ways to refer to it. And because it has really simple ingredients and is very modular in terms of how you can work with it, it has a lot of different names. But I just stuck with light straw clay because I could abbreviate it to LSC.
I think we should solve this problem by bringing in the Latin version of this, like we do with plants.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, we need a genus and species for this.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so light clay straw, or light straw clay, sorry, you basically build it, you infill it between timber members, and they can be 2x4s too, or 2x6s, right? They don't have to just be beams. And right. You use a framework, or almost like a cribbing in a way. You probably have a different, or a slip form, I think you called it, and you move it up. And when you've got this thing, this wall kind of packed in with light straw clay as the infill material, what do you get for an R value?
Depending on how much clay slip is applied, okay, that increases the density. And so you're relying on the hollow tubes in the straw as resisting heat flow, which is what the R stands for. So ideally, the thicker the wall, the higher your insulation, depending on how much light straw clay. Under ideal conditions, you're doing 13 pounds per square foot, which is sort of hard to regulate. It's like if you're tossing a salad, making sure that you have evenly distributed salad dressing on the entire salad, sort of a challenge. But ideally, under those conditions, you're getting R.2 to R.6 per inch. So with a foot thick wall system in the better half of North America here, or in the States is that you're getting an R21 wall.
Sorry, say that again. R.2 to R.6 per inch. Is that what you said?
1.2.
Oh, 1.2 per
or
inch.
1.6. Yeah. So
Okay.
you're getting at least 1 plus, at least 1.5 per inch is what you're going for.
Right.
And the other bonus, depending on your framing system, is that with this wall system, conventional construction, like what I'm in right now, is every 16 to 24 inches, there's a stud that continues from the interior to the exterior of your building. And that causes what we call thermal bridging, where heat and cold radiate through that stud because it's not as insulative as what you have in the wall cavity. Whereas with light straw clay, is you've kind of woven the light straw clay continuously between that. So you get a continuous thermal envelope. So you'll get a much higher performance overall than you do on just how it performs in a stud bay.
So, I mean, Larson trusses, then, is that something that you would typically use?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I love light straw clay, is because it is compatible with just about any framing system, whether you're talking metal, even if you're dealing with brick. There's a lot of different framing systems. But as a carpenter, and if you're trying to work with a carpenter who isn't well versed in timber frame or pole frame or all the other ways to frame a structure, is that you can basically frame up a wall very easily with Larson trusses or a split stud construction. So any conventional carpenter can set you up for this kind of insulation system.
Okay. So I want to come back to something you just said there, 13 pounds per square foot. So what's your trick to regulate the amount of mass that you're putting into a given area? Was it 13 pounds per cubic foot, or say that number again?
Correct.
Per cubic foot.
13 pounds per cubic foot is essentially code what you're going for. And my trick is I just try to make it as dry as possible in the mixing state where it still sticks together. And then because light straw clay can be done in so many different fashions, that there's ways where you're either using permanent formwork, a formwork that stays and becomes integral to your building, or a temporary formwork that you take off, like you would with concrete forms. And with the ones where you're taking it off, is you have a little bit less flexibility in how little slip or binder you can add to your material. So with that, they all have pros and cons and different applications, but that's what you're going for.
So it sounds like you're actually optimizing for lower density as opposed to higher density.
Right. If you're looking for higher insulation. So I've used it in interior wall applications where we're going for more sound insulation and a little bit more thermal mass and just kind of a buffer in interior spaces. Cool. Or if you're looking for something like fire resistance, then you're looking at something a little bit more dense.
So have there been fire tests on light straw clay?
As far as I know, I'm trying to think if I can recall an actual physical test, but in terms of how it's performed, like in the field and anecdotal, where I've just heard of like, oh, we didn't realize there was a fire. This has happened with straw bales where there's smoldering that occurs in the wall cavity where the straw bale is, that can go on for months. Right. And then Dave Arkin and Annie Telt, they're in California, and they've been doing a lot of looking into the buildings, how they performed after the Northern California fires. And there was a lot of learning there in terms of how well straw bale walls performed. And once again, it's always about detailing and circumstances. Nothing, is bulletproof essentially from all sorts of crazy things that are happening right now fire-wise. But it does, if I could upload my photos, and it might even be in the book, where there's a picture of a blowtorch going right onto light straw clay, and it really just smolders, because essentially what you've done is you've taken every little strand of straw that is essentially fiber and coated it in something that does not burn, which is clay.
Right. So from a building science perspective, I saw a couple of your photos, and for folks that are listening, we're going to actually share some photos from the book here shortly. But there's a detail in there, and I believe there were round timbers inside of one of the wall systems. And maybe while you're talking about it, I'll see if I can find that photo and bring it up. And one of the ways that you used to kind of key the light straw clay into the timber was using nails. Am I speaking correctly about that?
Yeah, you can use with one of the premises of natural building is it's people in a place using what they have to make shelter.
Right.
So, and with that, depending on what materials you have available to solve certain problems, it depends on how you solve problems. So I am a carpenter, so I like to solve problems with wood. And sometimes if I don't have wood, I have nails. But what the nails essentially do is you have a pole coming up, and where your light straw clay engages in that, because clay, as the water leaves it, shrinks it pulls away. And what those nails do is basically provide some kind of armature for your light straw clay to kind of grab onto. And you can also do that with a vertical piece of wood that goes along the side, which I would encourage if you're using a temporary formwork, so that you have something that the formwork can actually stick onto.
Right. And so what I was getting at there, here's the image, is that when you've got those nails inside the wall, in a climate like ours, which I'm not sure how much, well, I think you said that you've been in taught in Colorado, so you know what our climate is like. It's pretty close to that. But when you've got nails inside of a wall here, I'm just curious, does that create a condensation point? And do you ever have to worry about that? Or because the straw and the clay has such a high propensity for moisture that it can kind of manage that, those issues without creating a mold issue inside the wall?
Right. Given that it's a really small surface area overall, I would put it in I would worry less about it. But if I did feel like I had seen evidence in other buildings in the area that I live in where metal in a wall cavity has a tendency to rust or attract moisture, then I would do what I could to leave it out. You could use wooden dowels. You could do sort of like what says in B2, the one on the top, where there's just some round wood nailed to the side as something to hold the form.
Right.
Is that would be another option.
Cool. Awesome. Well, while I've got the book open, let's take a look at some of the buildings that you've produced. And if there's any specific cross sections that you want to speak to in terms of explaining what a light clay straw wall looks like, we can flip over to that as well. So tell us a little about this building.
Okay, so these are buildings done by a woman named Erica Ann Bush.
Yep.
And these are light straw clay structures. And you see that there's a living roof. It's got nice curves. It's on what's called, I think it's an urbanite foundation where they've used recycled concrete. And then it has, there's pros and cons, but where you have this one solid wrap of plaster skin around the exterior for protection. Mm-hmm. And you can see it's got the nice overhangs to protect those walls. These are all in the Pacific Northwest. I think all of her projects are. And clearly here, this is facing south for the passive solar gain. Right. And it's a small structure. And as a side note, I would love to see energy code be reflected in building size. So the smaller the building, the more it's going to be able to sustain its own temperature. But as you get to larger and larger buildings, R21 isn't adequate for a humongous building, particularly when you have great ceilings and you have a lot more space to heat. So I think in my ideal code world, that would be reflected, and builders would have to build appropriately according to size as well as climate.
So there's you've probably heard of it, but there is a metric called TEDI, and it's an acronym, and it's basically the thermal energy intensity of a building, and it's rated in kilowatt hours per meter squared. And I think something like that might help to represent what you're talking about there, because there's basically scale issues. Let's see if we can find light straw clay wall in here. So this would be an example, I'm assuming, of a light clay straw wall, and we've got some sprouting going on there. And you want to talk a little bit about what we're taking a look at here?
Okay, this is one of the most fun and interesting conversation pieces that happens when you build with light straw clay. Is that what you're doing is you're packing, particularly if you're using wheat, oat, barley, rye, any grains that aren't rice, essentially, because rice has a really high germination temperature, and all the other grains don't. So once you've filled up your walls and you've put your light straw clay in there, and it's usually in wet form. And it's usually during the summer when it's warm, is that those seeds germinate. And for some, it's a little bit perhaps unnerving or incredibly interesting, where you have sprouts coming out of your wall. But the best thing about this is it is essentially an indicator as to when your walls are dry, and that the drying process is going accordingly. So you can see right here, you've got maybe 6 to 8 inch long sprouts coming out of it. So this has been going on for a while. And one of the challenges, depending on what your climate is, it takes about a week per inch for walls to dry, depending on conditions. But that's a usual good way to budget when to start your project, and when you better be hoping that things are dry, so that you can cover them up. And particularly in the Pacific Northwest, as we have the 3-month building season where we know we're going to have dry conditions. And then the rest is, you know, our typical sort of cold and rainy. And here in this project, this is just at the edge where you can sort of see some of them are starting to wilt. And what happens is basically once there is no more moisture in your wall system, your grass seeds essentially die. And that's an indicator to say like, oh, okay, now your wall is dry. You can also use a moisture probe, but I just love this as a really elegant way to do that. And then you have this fiber that's already there that makes a good substrate for this plaster.
Totally. That's super cool. So that's really interesting, because in our ecosystem, like we've got 100 frost-free days. Our warm season's a little bit longer than that, but I was just doing the math on, we can look at some more photos here in a second. I'll just turn this screen share off. To get to our R30, which is kind of what we need to really feel warm in the wintertime here. I think anything less in this climate is not engineered enough or not designed enough. And I mean, that's just the deal with living in a climate that gets to -40. And so that's a 25-inch wall, maybe even a 30-inch wall, depending on how much you want to put in there. And so that's a really long drying period.
Right. And in a situation like that, there was a group in Alaska where they too have a really short building window. And the way they mitigated that challenge was to make bricks. And with a brick is that you have essentially 4 times the surface area. And, just like building adobes, is you lay them out and they dry much quicker, and then you're stacking them in. And I think if light straw clay has the capacity, we just need some creative, interested, young engineer entrepreneur types to come up with a process to essentially make bricks. And much like the Durasaw or raw straw or fast wall that is available down here for foundation systems, where it's essentially mineralized wood and concrete and cement.
Right.
I think we could be doing the same thing with light straw clay. And then that could be something that could happen. Not that I am totally pro everything happening in a factory and kind of perpetuating that disconnection, but when we look at the 14 million residential permits that get pulled in a year, if there was an option like that for people to make that choice, and it was affordable and it made sense, then it would be great if people made that choice. But if it's you on your own, you also have the capacity where you could make bricks, let them dry, and then stack them. And I think that there's always, once again, having this great flow chart of where the pros and cons of each of those things are.
So 2 things. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that we had talked a little bit about remodeling and retrofitting, as I think bricks would be fantastic for that, because it's already dry. You can put it up against whatever your exterior or interior cladding is, and then you have this natural insulation.
So there's a company here in Alberta, and if you ever come up here, I can introduce you to them. They're a company called Just Biofiber, and they've created these resin, they're plant oil-based resin blocks that look like Lego, but they're all they have are the columns in there. And I should try and find it on the internet here. Well, maybe when you're answering another question, I'll see if I can pull it up. And so they're using hempcrete, and so they put one of these Lego blocks in. They're probably about 18 inches long and probably 8 inches wide. And then they put it into a press, dump in a bunch of hempcrete, and then they've got this press that comes down, and then the little columns stick out just like a Lego block, so that you can basically, bring them together. And then they use a clay slip to connect the blocks together. So it's kind of a neat system.
Awesome. That's great.
I'm sure it would be appropriate for what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I feel like with natural materials, there's so much room for innovation. And even with light straw clay, the more people are doing it, the more we're making things efficient or discovering new, better ways to do this. And it's, I mean, for the past 20 years to sort of watch this evolution of how people do things, it's wonderful. I love it.
So I built or designed a passive house just south of Calgary for a client of mine, and it was built out of cross-laminated timber. So that's basically 3 layers of wood, and then a wood fiber board on the outside. So 100% wood wall. And I'm just curious because the wood fiber panels, they were basically probably, you know, close to 4x8 or 4x4. I can't remember the exact dimensions. And I'm wondering if you had the right formwork in a shop, let's say, and you got all this light straw clay and you packed it into a panel and then removed everything. Will this panel actually have some rigidity to it, and could you apply it to the outside of a building?
Depending on how thick it was and what your binder was. So, and or if you added some internal reinforcement. So with most light straw clay projects, I'm adding some internal reinforcement just because the straw fibers are usually less than 2 feet, which is usually about the average distance between your structural framing. So we'll either lay bamboo or wire or, you know, whatever we have to lay in there to kind of act as an internal rib cage. But I think that you could do something like that. And I remember for a while there was a product called straw board that was out there where people were pressing straw into making essentially sort of like an OSB oriented strand board product, and they had some really cool corrugated ones, and then for whatever reason they went out of business. And I just feel like that's a niche market, but it also takes, you know, an investment and commitment and getting it out there and lots of research and development, particularly the more processed it is.
Right.
So then, yeah, but I would love that happen.
So then if we were retrofitting a house, imagine we're putting a house onto a property that's being kind of reclaimed from a city, because that happens a lot here, and you can move them from the city to a piece of land. It's not that expensive to do it. And then we ripped off we were talking yesterday about vinyl siding and how much that gets used, and then wanting to kind of buttress out the insulation in the wall. Is the easiest way then just to literally add additional framing to the outside of the building, assuming we have big enough eaves to support that additional thickness in the wall? I mean, that's where I was kind of going with those panels. It's like maybe you could put light straw clay into the walls to replace the insulation that was there, and then add some pre-made panels that you make somewhere else? Or is it just framing it out, fill it up, and give her?
It depends on your foundation, just because when we talk about 13 pounds per cubic foot,
sure,
a wall system, despite having the misnomer light in there, it's actually very heavy in the end. So you'd really have to, in terms of retrofitting projects, you have to look at where you're going to distribute that weight. Like, can you actually physically hang it on the wall, or do you have some kind of foundation system to really support that over time? And there is a picture in the book where the Planetary Repair Institute, which is essentially the headquarters for city repair in Portland, where they did a retrofit, and they did basically 2. So they had their existing wall system, and then they put light straw clay on the inside, and then also light straw clay on the outside.
Interesting. Okay, I'll see if I can find that, show folks.
Yeah.
So yesterday,
it's in the color section.
It's in the color section. Okay. So yesterday you were talking about the fact that you really, like, one of your missions is to really kind of get more people interested and knowledgeable about this building technology. So what are your thoughts there? How do we go about doing that? How do we get this? I mean, you've written a book, so that's a good start. But what else are you kind of actively working on right now to promote this type of building material? I mean, as well as all the other ones that you work with.
Well, there's a lot of different sort of branches that I think, you know, not only one person can't do all of them, but we can all do some of them. And one of them is if you're watching this right now, is that you're educating yourself because you have a curiosity about it. And parallel in my life is I just inherited 2 beehives. So I'm trying to learn about these beehives, and there's a lot of different ways to learn. And there's books, there's videos, and there's talking to somebody who's knowledgeable and having them come over and show me how to do things, because I'm at that learning phase. And there's a lot of information out there. So the internet is full of tons of information, some of it more accurate than others. So from the homeowner perspective, if you're building a home, this is a huge financial, physical energy, emotional energy expenditure. And this is what I tell everybody who is asking me about wanting to build a home, is that I want to encourage them to make the best choice that they feel the best about, because you're going to have to live with it and pay for it physically and however else you want to measure what you're paying for. And then being realistic about what you can and want to do. So a lot of people approach me saying, I want to build my own house, but I work full time and I have 3 kids and it's complicated. So trying to figure out what is a healthy timeline, because we live in a society where everything is wanted to happen fast and cheap and quick, and that's hard to make that balance work out in a way that the end result is something that you will end up ultimately feeling really good about. So that itself is a whole other big topic. But another one is that once you get to that point of building a house, is that then you're talking to an architect or an engineer or a designer. And if they're not versed in the different varieties of wall systems out there, then that immediately kind of diminishes your option. And particularly if you come in with the question of like, hey, I really want to build this kind of wall system, and you get you're kind of crazy, or I've never heard of that kind of response, then either you really have to find someone who's going to support you in that, or you have to be a really good self-advocate. And in a culture of experts, sometimes it's hard to kind of hold your ground against somebody who might be considered an expert. And then say you do find someone that is going to be doing the design and architectural work, is that you need them to be well educated so that they can design a house that during the building process functions well, and then meets your needs over the life cycle of your inhabiting it. And with that, you'll also need an engineer who understands how these materials work. So that's the first layer. And then the really big layer is the economic aspect of it. So prior to 2008 economic crash here, is you could get a loan if you had a pulse, and now it's very difficult to get a loan. So people have to jump through a lot of hoops, and lenders are much less willing to lend on things that seem a little less conventional, or what is, from a real estate perspective, doesn't have comp values. There's nothing to compare this light straw clay building with versus something else. There are a lot of examples, and what's great is that there are a lot of really high-end examples. So from a banker's perspective, is that they want to see their financial investment grow, as you might too, but that might not be your fundamental priority, because it might be anathema to how you're living your life. So those are all those components where we need more effort, education, and inspiration in that department.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's lots there. I mean, we won't get into mortgages and debt slavery and all that stuff, but well, maybe we should. Maybe I'll ask you this. Like, do you think that natural building can play a role in, like, because when we started this interview, you talked about how approachable it was. It's not toxic. It's kind of like natural materials are indigenous to the planet, especially if you build based on the bioregional advantage that you've got. So looking at what your ecosystem produces and using that, does this potentially help to deal with some of those bigger kind of social issues around the fact that it takes 30 years of life energy to pay for a roof over our head?
Right. Absolutely. On a variety of levels. So in terms of the people that I've worked with over the course of my career or life path, however you want to sum it up, is that it has been this convergence of people from all different backgrounds and interests called to wanting to build a building, whether it's out of an environmental sensitivity, or if it's about ecological caring, or it's about wanting to be involved, or it's about wanting to create something that's locally based and reflective of their own values, or it's something that they just really want to be involved in, or it's more sustainable, or that they can do it all themselves for less than what you would do conventionally. So about kind of mitigating that mortgage debt. And for everybody out there, if you look at the definition of mortgage, in Latin, it's death grip, mortgage. Just keep that in mind when you're looking at whether you want a 6% or a 30-year, or how long a death grip you want. But most of us have experienced the death grip of a mortgage. But so the more you can invest your time and energy into place particularly things that don't have externalized costs. So if you're going to Home Depot and you're buying a bunch of 2x4s and whichever conventional materials go into your building, is you've externalized those costs. And one of the things that is sometimes a good reason, or one of the things that is definitely a good reason for choosing natural building, but can be a hard reason economically, is that the payoff is over a long period of time. So you might be spending more time and energy up front, but this building will pay for itself over time in durability, in human inhabitants' health, in the costs that we don't necessarily see as anybody who worked with these materials. They weren't as toxic and highly processed as a lot of the other materials. You haven't externalized that cost. You've owned it in a bit more of a way than most things that we do, because we live in a fundamentally disconnected society. And for me, from a philosophical point of view, is I see natural building as a technology of connection. It connects you to place, it can connect you to people, and then your home, once you have physically spent so much time with every material and each part of it, you really have a sense of ownership and home, as opposed to it being a commodity. It becomes more a part of who you are and how you represent yourself in the world.
That's really interesting. I was just listening to, was it Richard Heinberg, I think, on one of his YouTube videos, and he was talking about how bad it is that we've commodified housing, and the fact that we just kind of move around every 5 years. I think this is a little bit more prevalent in the US than Canada, but we're not far behind. And we just kind of see this house as this kind of like shell that we leave behind and sell to somebody else. But all this moving around that we do actually completely destroys communities. And so I really like that concept of how a natural building, which requires inherently more labor to build, is actually a technology of connection. That's a really fantastic way of talking about it. So I found your photo here of the retrofit. But before I get there, one of the other things that you said was the death grip thing. We have a bilingual country here in Canada, and mortgage in French means death pledge. So very similar. I'm sure the root comes from Latin originally. And what's really funny is that in Quebec, where they speak French, they don't offer mortgages. They offer hypothèques, because I don't think anybody in Quebec would go to the bank and take on a death pledge.
Yeah. Right.
Super interesting.
Marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyhow, I'm going to share this photo here. So folks, if you're still listening, there's lots of people on the channel right now. We're going to move to questions here shortly. So you can start putting your questions up there. I've seen a few of them pop up already, but put your questions up here for Lydia. If you have any questions about light straw clay, I keep saying it backwards. And we're going to be picking a winner for today's book shortly. Actually, while I'm bringing this photo up and Lydia's talking about it, if you're not on our newsletter list and you sign up every week, every time we do one of these interviews, we send out a coupon code that's good till Friday of the week for 25% off of the book. And so I'm going to put that coupon code up into the chat window if you're interested in acquiring this book, it's a really, really great book. I'm definitely going to be studying it in depth, because this is one of the modalities that we're looking at in terms of retrofitting our next house. So we'll bring that photo up here, and then Lydia can talk a little bit about this retrofit project. And I'm sure there'll be more questions for me as we go through this image. So that's the one you're talking about, right?
Correct. So yeah, that's okay. In Portland, very wet and rainy climate. It's an old turn of the century home. And so they are retrofitting it. And it's kind of hard to tell in this picture, other than that people are happy and you have a group of folks working on there. But you can sort of see in the background that there's 2x6s and there's probably some tar paper behind it, where they're going to do some infill on the exterior of the building. And then I think if you go down to the bottom right of that page, there's an image of the interior.
Right. So I'll just get a bit closer here.
Yeah.
Coming through. Let me turn the light on here. There we go. How's that?
Great. Yeah, so for folks tuning in, this is kind of what it looks like. It's a little messy for a while, but so is every construction site. And it's a very simple process. And also, it does require a few people in order to do this. And there's lots of different ways. So in the book, I also talk about scales of operation. So if it's a small scale, say you're doing a tool shed, which I highly recommend doing a small project of anything before you do a big project. So you can work the kinks out, find your more efficient ways to do things. There's always some learning. And then there's the large scale where you have a mixer. Yeah, so that picture right there is also in Portland. It's 120 square foot timber framed outbuilding with Larson truss and light straw clay. And it has a little sort of little shingle bottom there that you can see helps also mitigate any rain, because this is Pacific Northwest where it is really rainy there.
Right.
And generally, when it comes to straw-based projects, most people ask, can I do it in the Northwest? And yes, as long as you keep it dry, because straw has the same constituents as wood. Essentially, it's cellulose and lignin, just in different concentrates.
Right. And then you've got this other image that's kind of interesting, and I'm assuming that behind the wood sheathing, or sorry, the wood exterior there, that of the siding, there's probably a similar wall construction.
Right. So that was the building I was just in that was denying us interwebs. And so this whole front face here is light straw clay, and it is essentially conventionally framed. And then we have a rain screen on the exterior for wood siding. So in this particular area, this is sort of the aesthetic that all the buildings have, with the wood clad board and batten exterior. And they didn't really want to switch to plaster for this one, particularly with this huge south exposed face. And so you can get a variety of looks. And the nice thing, you could also do this with straw bale, but because straw bale has a tendency to have its own shape and have a little more organic curves to it, light straw clay is very flat. So if you like that look of, say, like a Japanese timber frame with a very flat plaster panels, light straw clay is very conducive to that.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, so for folks that want to see a little bit more, you'll see there's lots of construction details in here. And so if you actually are considering building with this building modality, I highly recommend checking out the book. And let's go over to Sarah here quickly. I'm going to stop my share. And Sarah, have you chosen somebody to win this week's book?
I have, actually. I'm going to go with Have Faith S.
Okay, awesome. So if you want to send an email, I'm going to put my email address up into the chat there. Then you can send us an email and we'll get all your details. If you live in North America, we're going to ship you that book, and our New Society will. And if you live outside of North America, you have the option to get the ebook. So I just put the coupon code up there. And so if you do want to purchase the book, you can go to newsociety.com and find the light straw clay book there, and you can use that coupon code to get a discount. If you're interested in asking questions, please put them up into the chat window there. And I'm going to go back here and harvest some of these questions for Lydia to answer. And let's see here. What's a good one? Okay, lots of great comments here. Are these buildings good for the Midwest?
Yes, they're, I'm totally drawing a blank, but there are quite a handful. Oh, I should know the name, in the Wisconsin area. And yes, I mean, basically anywhere. The beauty of these is that you can make your wall thickness at any thickness that you really want. You can use any kind of framing materials. Straw is basically readily available anywhere in the United States, and you can use a variety of different fibers too. So it could be rice, it could be oat. There's a lot of different ways to experiment with it. Clay is readily available. All of these are really available for the ideally non-toxic materials that anybody can get access to. And then they work with a variety of framing systems. So you could do them in the Midwest, you could do them in the Southwest, in the Northeast. The Northeast, there's a lot more, the more temperature extremes you get, the more you really have to think about the details in your building. And there's a great book, The Building Science, which is also part of this Essentials series through New Society Publishing, that really goes through a lot of the detailing, because the angel or the devil is in the details about how you build a project. And so this is where a huge amount of my work is consulting with homeowners who want to build a building, because a lot of it is it's very easy to do, but when you don't know what you don't know, that's when you run into problems in the long term. And a lot of those are just simple little details that sometimes you don't know until it's too late. And so my job is to help people not make those simple little mistakes, because I've had a ton of experience, and I can just say, oh, if you just do this little thing, or you put this little detail in the corner, it'll stop drafts and it'll stop air leakage. So it's a yes, anybody can do it. And the more information you have, the better things will be in the long run. So read a lot, talk to a lot of people. And if you can take a workshop somewhere, that's really one of the best ways. You get your hands dirty, you see how things are, instead of in a theoretical context, you really get to experience it and ask all your real-time questions.
Okay, so you just got 3 questions in my head as a result of that. But quickly, I'm going to be interviewing Diva on a future show. So this is the building science book that you were speaking of. And so stay tuned to our channel if you want to learn more about building science. So number one, you said you offer consulting services. How can people find out about that?
They could look me up online. The Flying Hammer is the name of my company. And here's another thing, is that I used to be licensed. I'm currently working with a friend of mine under his license, and he also does natural building, and that's Many Hands Builders. And we're neighbors, and we just share a lot of work. But since having a child, I've tried to simplify things.
Awesome. And then the other thing that has come up for me is, like, R-value is kind of a crappy metric, isn't it?
It's a frustrating metric, particularly when we talked about continuous versus broken up. So and then you could have great insulation, but then, at the top of the wall, there's a huge gap up in here. And so, or a huge window in that space, or you overdo the windows and you don't detail your windows. So, I mean, I know it comes from a place of like, yes, we want to take energy conservation into mind when we're building our buildings and build them efficiently. But again, it's the devils are in the details. And a number R21 on a pink roll of fiberglass poorly installed is not an R21 wall.
Well, and like what I'm getting at though is that if you've got 13 pounds per cubic foot and you're getting R1.2, 1.6 per inch, that's not that 1.2 to 1.6 per inch is not equivalent to 1.2 to 1.6 per inch in foam.
Right.
Because it totally changes the mass of the building.
Right. So I think we do have to come up with a different way to measure how insulative certain materials are. And I mean, some of them we know that aren't that insulative. So if you have just a stone wall, that's conductive and you're going to be very cold and need a lot of firewood. But if you have something that's highly insulative that is also slightly massive, so with straw bale buildings is that they always have a pretty thick coat of plaster on either side, is that then you have this combination of insulation and mass, so that you might be sort of being able to maintain a temperature balance as opposed to just making it really tight and well insulated. Right.
So another good question here is how deep and high can you build the walls given the drying time involved? And so is there a maximum, even if you live in a hot climate, at some point, does the thickness of the wall detrimentally affect the inside because the drying time is so long once you get inside?
Right. That's a great question. And I am hoping to do some experiments with some kind of additives. So I know Chris Magwood up at the Endeavor Center in Canada, he uses something called metakaolin, where a clay goes through almost a chemical change to make it almost like a lime that goes through where it hardens into calcium carbonate, to come up with something that would cure instead of dry without creating without using a lot more embodied energy. But yes, your question about if it's a very thick wall system and you have really wet material and wet conditions, it's not an ideal situation. So like I mentioned earlier, the people in Alaska with a very short building season, they decided to mitigate that issue by creating bricks so that you could have a 2-foot wall building, and you just build a foot thick brick here and a foot thick or something so that you know that you can get your materials to dry out in time. So that's definitely one of the challenges with straw clay, is that dry time. So a great development in the future will be figuring out how to either decrease or not have to deal with a dry time.
So just coming back to those bricks then, would you connect the bricks with a clay slip in between?
Possibly, or maybe I would just kind of compress them in there. So with my straw bale projects, I almost always compress my wall systems for fear that they'll settle and leave a gap at the top of the wall, which is just terrible for air leakage. And that way I have control over it. But because straw clay is not load bearing, is you have to do a minimal compression, but you wouldn't want big air gaps between the bricks. Or you could design a brick. The folks who did it in Alaska, they actually had holes in the middle so they could do straw clay in the middle of the hole, knowing that, much like a cinder block, is that you would have something continuous going all the way through the wall system, but then it would also suck all the moisture out because the brick is dry. Right.
Okay. Another question, how did they use urban concrete, or urbanite, I think is the word you used, for the floors and the foundation?
Right. So I haven't seen this done on a permitted residential project, but I have seen it used, and I've used it myself on small scale projects. And here in the US, you can build a 200 square foot building without a permit. Granted, it's limited use. You couldn't call it a whole house and live in it, although I have done that for many years, and have helped people build their 200 square foot homes. And now there's been legislation to legalize tiny homes, which is a whole other awesome topic. But for projects like that, is basically when the city comes in, or whoever, say there's a construction project and they break up sidewalk chunks, they come out in like these big, almost like continental pieces, and you can essentially stack them like stones. And if you mortar between them, and if you're in a seismic zone, like basically almost always lived in a seismic zone, so we have to consider uplift, all of these crazy factors, is then to create some kind of concrete bond beam on the top that kind of unifies this mortared together recycled concrete, essentially, that I've used that in a lot of projects. And the nice thing about urbanite is, aesthetically, on some level it's pleasing. On another level, you can stucco over it or plaster over it, and it's a great reuse of something, instead of pouring more concrete.
Right. Okay. How about termites and bugs?
Great question. So I have never seen evidence of bugs in light straw clay. I think it is just ultimately not friendly to them with all of the clay in there. And even in my straw bale work, I've only worked on one project where we had a minor interesting insect infestation, but it's really important to detail so that you're not inviting insects into your building. So a really good detail between foundation and wall system is important, whether you have flashing is key. Particularly, I live in an area where there's carpenter ants, and they're really difficult to get rid of. They're not interested in the straw clay, they're interested in your wood. And same thing with termites. I have heard a few reports of somebody seeing some termite issues in the tubular sections of the light straw clay, but again, they weren't interested in the insulation, they're interested in the wood. So you have to do the same details and protections for any wood structure that I would do the same for light straw clay, and particularly making sure that, you know, all your openings for plumbing and electrical are really detailed well, because mice are a pain in the butt no matter what you live in. And I've never had an incidence. Basically, all the buildings on this property that are light straw clay are the ones that don't have rodents in them. And that could be for a variety of reasons, but detailing is one of those things where we take really good care to make sure that we do the good details, because rodents are not fun.
Have you seen some of the photos of how foam is failing in foundations?
Oh no, but that sounds horrible.
Yeah. So what happens is when the foam gets wet, the ants will come in, they literally honeycomb the whole thing.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we do a lot of work up here where we have horizontally protected foundations, or we go like even ICF. Not necessarily projects I'm doing, but just that you see it all over the place, right? And so you know, it's easy. Chris Magwood, I think, talks about this in his book, Sustainable Home Design, and how, and the example he gives is of wood. He's like, if we were trying to bring a flammable, rotting, like material that can rot and harbor insects to market right now, no one would go for it. Yet we've kind of identified the pros and the cons of this element, and we've designed around it. And so we shouldn't necessarily look at straw as, or any of these natural building methodologies, any differently than we look at wood. It's like, we can figure out wood, we can figure out all these other things. And I find in my own work, my own consulting work, that people will look at you, if you talk about straw, like you're some crazy dude or gal, and like instantly want to go to that foam solution. But it's, you know, it has its own problems. And, you know, just embedding it with formaldehyde or whatever other toxic chemical you can think of, like ultimately that's going on to your property and you're dealing with it. It's just interesting how we have these biases that they create opacity, you know, in our vision, or they make us myopic to the real issues at hand. And so I think the word that kind of sticks out for what you said there is details. Doesn't matter what you're using, if you're not sorting out the details, it's going to come bite you in the ass.
Right. And I stress, I mean, I think by drawing out and trying to solve a lot of problems ahead of time, some people think very differently. And yeah, the phrase in construction is think like water.
Right.
So you really have to think about water is the element that eats every house, no matter what it's made out of. So you really have to think like water in order to keep the water that's in, get it out how you want it to go out, and the water that's outside to not come in the way you don't want it to come in. And the same applies for insects. And yeah.
Interesting.
But I haven't heard any problems. That would be over time. I mean, there are light straw clay. It does have a really long history in Europe, but a relatively short history here. So, but none of those stories about insects from Europe seem to have migrated over here. Yeah.
Interesting. 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up for the day. So the first one is, what about electrical wires and how do you manage that? And the second one was, I'll let you answer that and then I'll have the second one ready. It just kind of left my mind as I was asking the first one.
Right. No worries. Actually, your electrician will probably love you, depending on your building system, because with split stud and Larson truss is that you almost always have a gap between your studs. So you can just run your electrical wire. And if my pictures had made it through, then particularly with split studs, sometimes we're having 2 parallel bottom plates on the bottom, and you can run your electrical wires through the bottom, which is definitely my preferred method. And then basically keeping the wire out of the field allows for you to sort of know where your electrical wires are for the most part, because as you come back and want to remodel or put a picture in the wall or do anything, is that you know they're sort of out of harm's way. And for same thing with straw bale projects, is I usually recommend is like a kitchen is an area where I might consider running the wire in conduit, just because the kitchen is the most likely place to get remodeled. But other than that, I usually don't. There's no need to put stuff in conduit, but you do have to have wire that's compatible with being exposed to moisture, because the light straw clay is moist during the time of application and then dries out.
Cool. All right. One more question came in here. Can you use light straw clay to build a rebar enforced dome? What I'm essentially asking is, can it be waterproofed on the outside?
That is a good question. I would recommend against it, because a key component of a clay-based wall system is breathability. And I think with any healthy wall system is breathability, because in order for you to seal off a dome from exterior water is you're essentially sealing any vapor that happens in there, unless you require or make way for really good mechanical ventilation, is that you're going to be trapping any water vapor in there. Domes, I would probably leave to something like bricks. Or other materials. But I have friends in Colorado that built a straw bale dome and covered it in cement plaster. And as far as I know, it's still standing. But I think given my knowledge and given that I have seen projects to the point where now we're remodeling them, so I get to kind of go in and excavate and see how they've survived the test of time, is that has been highly educational to see whether the rebar in the middle of a straw bale does indeed rust over time. Here so far in Southern where am I? Oregon. I have not seen that, but up in Portland, I have seen rusted rebar. So, and that depending on what you're using your dome for, but if you're in there, we generate so much vapor. It's amazing. And I think a lot of us, particularly where you live, if you live in an old leaky house, you're not really noticing it as much. But if you live in a really tight building, or if you take a hot shower and close the door and turn the fan on, you see all that vapor that's being generated. And so that, I think you could run the risk of some kind of collapse or something that might not be ideal. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I think you really have to heavily rely on mechanical ventilation and an amazingly perfectly sealed exterior.
I'm curious, what do you typically use as mechanical systems in your homes?
I'm a pacifist in the sense of liking things to passively ventilate. So I get a little annoyed when I'm required to put in mechanical ventilation.
Yeah.
Just because I have lived rurally the vast majority of my life, and the power goes out. So if you if you're reliant on mechanical devices to do things for you that are also maybe so engineered that you can't do the thing yourself, then you're reliant on being grid tied in order for something to function. So, I do in a bathroom that makes the most sense. You turn a fan on, it exhausts a room that gets a high amount of moisture, just like mechanical ventilation over a cooktop. Those both make total sense. But to require mechanical ventilation for your house, for residents, it seems like I would much rather have the relationship of opening and closing my windows for ventilation and being personally responsible, rather than having a machine that can malfunction that I don't know how to fix. I can fix my behavior, but I can't fix the Alexa doing crazy things in my house.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think the best engineer is one that takes machines out of the house. One of the big challenges we have here when it gets to the kind of extreme depths of cold is that opening a window at -40 it can work, but you're basically taking your air changes per hour up to 5 or 6 or whatever it is. And so, when I look at, I'm kind of like Neo in the Matrix. I don't see, I see gigajoules, or maybe a better analogy is, what was that video or that movie where the kid sees dead people? I don't see dead people. I see gigajoules. And, and so I was just up at Chris Magwood's house about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he was showing me these Lunos systems. Have you seen those?
Mm-mm.
They're amazing. They're from Europe, and basically they're 6-inch diameter tubes that would fit right through your walls, so you could build your light straw clay around it. They take a small computer fan. They have a clay core in the middle, and you buy them in units of 2. And so you might put one on one side of your house and one on the other, and they work together. And so when one's blowing into the house, the other one's sucking out. And then after 30 seconds, they flip around, they go in the other direction. And so as the air is being extracted from the house, the clay core absorbs moisture, and which is important in my climate because we're super dry. It absorbs a little bit of moisture and it absorbs the heat, and they can get a 92% heat recovery on it. And we're literally talking about 2 tiny little computer fans. And then you fit them with an air filter on the outside. And so we can get, instead of putting in a $15,000 or $20,000, central air system, like heating system, literally, right, if you've got a wood stove, a couple baseboards, and a couple of these Lunos systems, which are super simple, you're done.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, so check them
check
out. They're from Belgium, Lunos. I'll put the name up in the show notes here. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for taking the time today. I know you're super busy right now, and you're you didn't realize it, but bragging about how nice it is out there. We're still covered in snow and cold outside. So our daffodils have not poked up yet, but or tulips, I should say. But I really appreciate you taking the time, and it's been really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And you guys put a lot of work into this. And thank you for folks who are watching that dealt with some technical difficulties. Appreciate your patience.
Yeah, no worries. Sarah, did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, no, just thanks a lot. It's been great to be involved again, and lovely to meet you, Lydia, and to listen to all the great information. It's awesome.
Yeah, good.
Thanks so much.
Hopefully we'll see more of each other.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, talk to you guys soon.